Today, we're going to take a look at the spread of communism throughout the world during the 1900s and the Cold War, which is the conflict that ensues between the communist countries and the capitalist and democratic countries. Now, just as a review here, communism is when a society takes all its private property and says no one owns it anymore, everything is owned by everyone, and so they share that property, and then people are going to be paid based on they're going to work the job that they're best at, and then they're going to get paid based on the needs that they have. And so this is hopefully going to make everyone equal and get rid of the classes, which is the whole goal in communism. Countries that will adopt this during this time are the Soviet Union, China, North Korea, Vietnam, Cuba, Cambodia, and Laos. But the one interesting thing with these compared to what actually communism expected, or Karl Marx expected to happen with communism, was that he was hoping or thinking that they would happen in industrialized nations, and instead what happens is these are adopted by agrarian societies that then want to industrialize their country. And so we're going to see two examples of that when we look at the Soviet Union and China here. The Soviet Union becomes communist after their 1917 revolution. That is led by Vladimir Lenin. He brings in the Bolshevik Party, and they take over the government, set up communism, will win a civil war between them and the Red Army is their army against the White Army, which backs Tsar Nicholas II, who had resigned, or backs a more democratic or less communist form of government than Lenin did. He'll come out on top of that, and so it will solidify Russia as a communist power. During this time, the Tsar will resign from his position. He'll abdicate the throne, and he will also be killed, so that there's no possibility of the royal family coming back in and fighting for the throne anymore. Also, during this revolution, Russia will drop out of World War I, which led us to problems with World War II, in that they weren't happy, and so they worked with Germany to take over Poland, and then just some other conflicts around there, being them a communist state and not being on the same side with the British and the French. Now, throughout this revolution, they are Lenin, and then later Stalin, after Lenin dies in 24, will be consolidating power, putting all the power in the Communist Party that is running the government, and they will also be trying to get rid of all private property and all class distinctions. So that's Russia. On the flip side, you have China, which won't become communist or successfully have a communist revolution until 1949, but that revolution began 2 decades earlier, or over 2 decades earlier, in 1921. The revolution is really led by Mao Zedong. He's the major figurehead of it, and he is fighting against the nationalist party known as the Kuomintang, who aren't really doing a good job ruling. They took over in 1911 after the fall of the Qing dynasty. They're corrupt. They're not doing a good job keeping the Japanese at bay during World War II, and so people lose confidence in them. And on top of this, the majority of the population are peasants, and the communists work with the peasants and try to get the peasants on board. They teach them, they give them pamphlets, they try to bring more rights to the peasants, while the Nationalist Party was supporting more of the elite group of citizens and focusing more on the cities. So with this, Mao Zedong is able to lead his revolution against the Nationalist Party and win in 1949, but they will not eliminate the Nationalist Party. Instead, they flee to Taiwan, and Taiwan's this little island, well, kind of a big island, off of China. And this leads to some problems that we have here today, because China doesn't recognize Taiwan as a country, and neither do we. But China wants to regain Taiwan, and we say, no, you can't go and regain Taiwan, and we will protect the government that is there. So, kind of interesting situation now because of that that we have going on today, all because of something that happened back here in 1949. Now, even though the Soviet Union and China are both communist countries, they do things a little bit differently, and in the end they will actually start to dislike each other and will look at each other as rivals, and will almost well, will fight occasionally and almost come to nuclear war with each other. Um, Big thing to start with is they both have a very similar government. They both have the Communist Party. It's a one-party system that leads the government, and they're led by strong figureheads. Stalin is the major leader in Russia for the majority of it, or in the Soviet Union. It's kind of setting up everything after Lenin dies, and then Mao sets up most everything in the Chinese government. When these two guys pass on, they will pass on this chair to another leading Communist Party figure. So Stalin will pass it on to Khrushchev, and Mao will pass it on to a guy named Deng Xiaoping. Um, Both these guys will then continue to pass it on as time goes on, as they step down from their position or die in office. Both countries will also have a collectivization program where they try to bring in all the farmland, take it away from private hands, and put it all in public hands and make the people work it. In the Soviet Union, this doesn't work out too well. People resist it. They fight against it. Those people that resist will end up in the gulags. And the people that don't resist it don't necessarily know what they're doing farming-wise, and so production goes down, and that leads to major starvation in the Soviet Union. On the other hand, China has a lot of support for it because, well, they're supported by the peasants, and they've been working with the peasants and kind of understand how to do this process, and they get rid of the lords, which there's been a major problem with, or major fight between the lords and the peasants. So they they are supported by the peasants, and it's a pretty easy process. Not perfect, but it works its way out, and much better than it does in Russia or the Soviet Union. Then for industrialization, both of them come up with plans to industrialize the country and bring it to a major power. In the Soviet Union, it's called a 5-year plan that was set up by Stalin, and it focuses on major industries, building up the major industries of a country, major manufacturing jobs, cars, big appliances, those types of things, steel, all that stuff, and focusing on that and bringing people to cities and urbanizing the country. While in China, it's more of a focus on, because Mao wants to help the peasants and keep the peasants or make the peasants equal to those that are in the cities, he focuses on industrializing the countryside and building foundries throughout the countryside for peasants to smelt their own iron into steel and revolutionize the economy or build up the economy that way. Both of these plans fail. They work out kind of well. They do industrialize the country a little bit, but not to the levels they were thinking about, and it leads to starvation and death within the countries, and so millions of people die in both of these. And in Russia, or in the Soviet Union, it leads to a class of privileged elites that know how to run the businesses and keep it in the family, and they are better off than the average citizens are. In China, it fails. Mao Zedong realizes that, takes a step back for a little while, lets things recover, and then tries to do it again in the Cultural Revolution, where he tries to erase kind of older cultures that he felt got in the way, like Confucianism, Taoism, those types of things that take away from the communist culture. And he has a major fear of the capitalist culture and ideas coming back in, so he goes and fights against those while he's industrializing. So this will lead to more people dying there because there's fear that they are going to turn against him and his government, and so they end up working in work camps and dying in those, or just disappearing. And now, although they're very similar to what they're doing, again, they end up disliking each other a lot. The USSR will tolerate the privileged status and will allow kind of different classes to rise up in the Soviet Union, while China, this happens, but Mao Zedong is trying to fight that. And so this is a major bone between the two, and that both are saying that we are doing communism right and you guys are doing it wrong, and they bicker with each other and fight with each other, and it leads to the Soviet-Sino War, and it'll lead to almost the two sides blowing each other up with nuclear weapons, or threatening to do so. And so what we have here is we got the collectivization you can see in Russia here, and then in China, this is the Great Leap Forward with all those foundries being placed in the countryside. Sounds like a great idea, but it really doesn't work out in the end. It was supposed to look like this up here, nice, cool, beautiful picture. People are all wealthy and everything because communism is awesome, but In reality, it does not play out that way at all. Instead, people's lives get worse off because of it. So one thing or a couple things we see with the people is there's the thing that gets worse is there's always a fear of the capitalists infiltrating the country and trying to turn it back to a capitalist country instead of being communist. And so this leads to a lot of human rights abuses and will lead to purges, killing millions of people in both countries. And that's anyone that questions what's going on, whether they're communist or not, or loyal or not. It doesn't matter. If they start questioning things, they end up disappearing. And in Russia, they're sent to gulags, which are like concentration camps or work camps, where they'll go in, they'll work until their time's up or until they get killed there, whether it's from the cold, hunger, accident, or they get shot, whatever it may be. So there are some bad things that happen with this. At the same time, for women, there's actually more equality. In both countries, organizations are set up to help push forward women's rights. In the Soviet Union, it's Zenotdel, which advocates for women to have the right for an abortion, advocates for the right for divorce, advocates for them to be in the workforce, get educated, and doing all those things to try to bring them up to where men are and try to end the patriarchy. Now, this doesn't completely happen. Women are actually more expected of them than the men, on the other hand, because they're expected now to work a job and to raise a family. So they have more responsibilities now. So it doesn't solve everything, but it brings about some more equality than was there before. And then in China, they push for divorce, marriage rights, no more child marriages, things like that, education. But they're also fighting against thousands of years of culture from Confucianism, which which is really hard to fight against. And so in some areas that it just doesn't happen. It doesn't change a whole heck of a lot. Now, these two countries, what goes on in these two countries will then carry over to the whole world. Primarily, it's more going to be focused on the Soviet Union than China with the Cold War, but China gets involved in a couple areas. And what a Cold War is, it's a conflict or it's a war between nations, but there is no actual fighting or direct fighting between those two countries. So in this Cold War, the U.S. never goes and bombs the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union never goes and bombs the U.S. However, what will happen is see conflicts happen between the U.S. and smaller countries that then the Soviet Union will back, and the U.S. will do the same against the Soviets. Or you'll have threats of doing something to another, and those will be reciprocated. And this war will last almost 50 years. It'll go from 1945 to 1991 in the fall of the Soviet Union. Now, looking at the map here, you can see all the countries in the world and kind of where they're at with this. All the blue countries you can see are aligned with the West and with capitalism and democracy, or at least with capitalism. Some of these countries have dictatorships, but they are not going to communism. On the other hand, you can see the red countries are the ones that align with the Soviets, and then you have some other communist countries that in the yellow that are not aligned with the Soviets, and instead kind of do things on their own, or in Asia they're more closely aligned with China and what China's doing. And you can see it breaks down from in the middle of Europe, and we have Eastern Europe here that's red and it's communist bloc, and then you have Western Europe, which is a democratic capitalistic bloc. And what we call this region here, or that borderline between the two, is the Iron Curtain, because there was nothing getting through to the other side. We couldn't communicate with, well, yeah, communications and trade between the two sides pretty much stops, and the Europeans are now divided. Now, this war just doesn't start from anything, or doesn't just start out of thin air or anything like that. Instead, it develops out of World War II with the end of the war and deciding how the world's going to be divided up and who's going to be doing what. And then it really gets going after World War II is over. What's going to happen is the U.S. is going to set up an alliance system called NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, that will protect all of Western Europe from Eastern Europe and the communists and the USSR. while in response to that, the Soviet Union will then set up the Soviet Pact, or the Warsaw Pact, that will then have all the East Bloc countries in Europe protected by the Soviet Union. Another thing that escalates this confrontation of this Cold War is the Marshall Plan, which the U.S. was using or sets up to try to prevent the spread of communism and to revitalize Europe and keep it from falling into kind of a depression-like state that we have after World War I. And all this is this is done with sending a lot of money over to Europe to pay for rebuilding cities, rebuilding whatever needs to happen. And the U.S. offers this to all countries. However, the Soviets kind of see through this and see this as a plan to stop the spread of communism, and so they say, no, we're not jumping on board with this. Instead, Stalin sets up two organizations, or he continues one and sets up another. Comintern continues to unite the Soviet or the communist countries, and then you have Comecon, which is set up to bring together the communist economies, and the Soviet Union will give support to those economies that need help. And so this is all to try to keep the communist countries communist, while the Marshall Plan is there to keep the Western nations or the democratic capitalistic countries capitalistic, and their goal is to also stop the spread or the containment of communism, which is through that containment policy. Now, one other thing that escalates this confrontation is the constant threat of brinkmanship, which is the threat to use nuclear arms to get your way. And so this leads to both countries building up nuclear arsenals to protect themselves from the other, and will also lead to other countries looking to develop their own nuclear weapons to protect themselves so they can't be used on them. And so we'll see that here in a picture coming up. The first slide here, though, that we have for pictures is this is the Marshall Plan. You can see the German city in the top left there. That's after World War II. And then the bottom one is after the Marshall Plan. It's completely rebuilt and looks pretty good. It's mostly recovered, and by the middle of the 60s, 70s or so, Western Europe is starting to flourish again. It's getting back into the groove of things. And on the right, you can see a map of where all the money is going to. And you can see Britain and France are getting a ton. West Germany gets a lot. Italy gets a lot. Greece and Turkey get a good amount as well, because they're trying to, one, rebuild these countries that were ravaged, and two, countries like Greece and Turkey were thought that they might go to and might become communist countries, and so they pump a lot of money in there to prevent that from happening. And then here we have the idea of the nuclear arms race. Here you can see today just what we have. Today we've got 9,400 warheads. Russia has 13,000 warheads. During the height, there was a heck of a lot more warheads out there, and they were pointed at each other. The Soviet Union pointed their nuclear weapons at the U.S., and the U.S. pointed them at the Soviet Union, all in the idea that they needed to, that if someone fired one, we were going to retaliate and wipe their country off the face of the map. And so with those tensions there, we also get tensions of other countries jumping in because they want to be able to protect themselves. So you have Great Britain develop nuclear weapons. You have China develop nuclear weapons. Israel develops nuclear weapons, all to protect themselves and save each other, or save themselves from other conflicts. And so this builds up that tension. And then we start seeing those tensions pop out in events. We have the Berlin airlift in 1948, where Berlin is cut off from Eastern or Western Europe, since it's in the middle of Eastern Europe, all in the hopes that the West will abandon West Berlin. The West says we're not doing that, and so they send tons of airships to Berlin to resupply it and keep it from keep the people there from starving. The Korean War will then come up next in the 50s, and the U.S. will fight there under the UN to defend South Korea from the invaded North Korea, which is trying to reunite the country. And this will be a hard-fought war where the U.S. and the North Koreans will go back and forth, or the UN and the North Koreans will go back and forth. Not necessarily because the North Koreans have a lot of power. They actually almost get wiped out and conquered. But then China starts backing them, and so um, what happens is the war pretty much ends up in a wash, and the country was divided on the 38th parallel, and it's pretty much still divided on the 38th parallel. It's a little different, but it's pretty similar to where it was before the war began. And then another major one we have is the Cuban Missile Crisis, and that happens in the Western Hemisphere. And what we have here is the Soviet Union secretly snuck on to Cuba nuclear weapons so that then they could fire those nuclear missiles at the U.S. And this leads to a 13-day standoff of everyone sitting on the edge of their seats trying to figure out, are we going to go to nuclear war and we're going to blow up this planet? Luckily, after 13 days, both sides back down. The Soviet Union backs down and takes the warheads out of Cuba, and the U.S. takes warheads out of Turkey that they could fire at Russia pretty easily. So luckily it stands down, but this was the height of brinksmanship and almost led to a major nuclear war, which would not have been good for anyone. And so things start going down, less of the brinksmanship, but it's still there. And then two of the last major events in this are the Vietnam War and the war in Afghanistan. The Vietnam War is a U.S. led war to try to keep the communists from taking over South Vietnam, which doesn't work. Several thousand U.S. soldiers will die over there, significantly less than what happens in World War II, but the U.S. public did not like the war, didn't feel like we should be there, that it was our job to do anything about that, and so we eventually pull out, and South Vietnam will eventually be taken over. So this war shows a little bit of the weakness of the United States in the West, but the United States bounces back and recovers from this. However, the war in Afghanistan, which is not the current war in Afghanistan, but actually in the 1980s, is with the Soviet Union trying to support an Afghan government that's communist, and they will fight there for about 10 years trying to keep them in place, but they lose out. As you might see from today, Afghanistan is a very difficult place to fight in. It's very difficult to knock all the enemies out or find all the enemies with all the mountainous terrain and places to hide. So there's a problem there with that. And also, we heavily fund the rebel fighters against the communists who are called the Mujahideen. And so we fund them primarily through a guy named Charlie Wilson, who was a senator who wanted to fight the communists. And so he heavily funded the war and got the U.S. to fund the Mujahideen, which allowed them to beat the communists. And then the last thing we'll look at here is after this war, communism starts to go down. It's the tail end for now the Soviet Union. They are falling apart. They've spent a lot of money in Afghanistan, failing to keep that a communist state. They are trying to be more reform-minded under a new leader called Mikhail Gorbachev. He sets up two programs called the Perestroika and Glasnost. Perestroika makes their economy more democratic, or not democratic, but capitalistic. But it doesn't really work out very well. Instead, what happens is oligarchs rise up, or people, a small group of elites rise up and kind of control most of the businesses there. And then Glasnost was allowing more freedom of speech and openness in what the government's doing. And that just upsets people more, and they start critiquing, and what will eventually happen is these countries will start to break away from the Soviet Union in the late 1980s, early 1990s, and by 1993, the Berlin Wall will have fallen, and the USSR will have dissolved into several different countries of Russia, Kazakhstan, Ukraine, Belarus, Latvia, Estonia. All these regions now become their own independent countries. And then in China, it doesn't collapse. Communism is still running that country, but after Mao dies, they start becoming more capitalistic, noticing that the communist reforms, the Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution, weren't working as they were intended to, and the Chinese economy was falling behind. And so they make some capitalistic reforms, bring in foreign business to come and help them out. And as you can see today, their economy is growing very, very strong. And um, it's all because they have done a slow process of reforming their economic system, and while keeping the Communist Party in power and maintaining stability there. So today, there aren't many communist countries left. There are a couple. Cuba still communist, Vietnam, North Korea are, but they're not to the levels they were, or not as strict as they were back in the middle of the Cold War, and they're not as powerful as they are because the major powers in China and the Soviet Union, well, one's fallen apart and the other is shifting away from communism, other than the idea that the Communist Party will maintain control. And so this pretty much wraps up the Cold War. It ends in about 1991 after the Berlin Wall has fallen and a lot of the countries in the Soviet Union have dissolved, and then there's no longer a threat between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, and all that's left is one superpower, and that being the United States.